And welcome to today's Industry Week webcast. Industry 4.0's Big Challenge. Where do I put all this data? Sponsored by Lumen. My name is Robert Schoenberger, and I'm editor-in-chief of Industry Week. Before we begin, let me explain how you can participate in today's presentation. First, if at any time you're having audio difficulties or slides are not advancing, simply hit your F5 key to refresh your webcast console. If you are running pop-up blocking software, you will need to disable it to view the webinar. If you are having any technical difficulties during today's session, please press the question mark help button in the upper right corner to receive assistance in solving common issues. This webinar technology allows you to resize the presentation by clicking the maximize icon in the upper right corner to enlarge the window. We welcome your questions during today's event. To submit your question, simply type your question into the Ask a Question window on the left side of your screen and then hit the Submit button. We'll be answering as many questions as possible during the Q&A session that will follow the main presentation, but please feel free to send in your questions at any time and we'll add them to the queue. Please also be aware that today's session is being recorded and will be available on the Industry Week website within the next day for you to review. You'll be notified by email when the archive is available. When the webinar ends, please take a moment to complete the feedback form that will appear on your screen. All right, so today's topic, Industry 4.0's Big Challenge. Where do I put all this data? Record, measure, and analyze. That's been the constant message for more than a decade as big data initiatives have found creative ways of boosting productivity and cutting costs. With new IoT or video deployment, manufacturers must process and store more and more new time series and image data from sensors and cameras. This data must be secure and accessible from multiple sites for analysis, control, quality, training, and reporting, and useful by emerging artificial intelligence, machine learning, computer vision, and analytics technologies, often in near real time. Cloud storage has become the de facto standard for consumer and enterprise IT data, but our topic today is why edge storage may be better for manufacturing OT data. Discussing that topic with me today are Dave Cooper, Senior Vice President of Edge Computing Solutions at Lumen, Rick Scurfield, Chief Commercial Officer at NetApp, and Steve Wallow, Chief Technology Officer at Vicinity. Dave, let's start with you. What does edge computing mean at Lumen, and how is it relevant to today's manufacturers?
All right, thanks, Robert. Well, Lumen has a long history in supporting the connectivity requirements of the enterprise, especially the last few years with the hybrid cloud ecosystem. And as more and more workloads have moved to the public cloud, this has become even more the case of challenges and constraints with enterprises and only having really two modes of venues for compute and storage requirements, the centralized public cloud or private data center, or the actual hyper-localized on-premise, either in a manufacturing facility or enterprise customer location. As technology continues to evolve and next generation use cases come to pass, cloud locality is starting to matter more and more to meet that higher, the tighter latency windows that we're looking for, to be able to manage and scale the enormous amounts of data being generated by all of these new use cases. So to Lumen, edge computing represents those localized venue options to the enterprise with the benefits of the cloud. Allowing the enterprise to explore, to innovate, and to adopt these new technologies without having to overhaul all of their localized on-premise compute and storage. And for manufacturers who are constantly looking to reduce their overall costs but continue to innovate, it holds a great opportunity to be able to incrementally incorporate new technology without a huge upfront investment. Not to mention all of the potential for backup and disaster recovery benefits that an edge computing venue can hold.
Great. Let's move on to the next question here. What are the edge use cases that are generating all this data? Dave, let's go to you for that one.
All righty. Well, there's a ton of use cases that are coming out. There are some that are already in practice today, being done at localized facilities. But let's talk about four of them specifically, and we're going to break them into roughly 3 or 4 categories. The first is that modern factories are continuously adding new sensor technology. This is to monitor machine uptime and performance. You think about data points like pressure, temperature, vibration, various other operational environmental data. And all this data is being used to provide simple optimizations for OEE reporting and then being fed into AI algorithms to be able to run use cases like predictive maintenance. Factories are also adding digital camera technology and doing and providing optical inspection for product quality, for worker safety, and even for security reasons. This involves collecting and processing high-speed images of product on conveyors, of employees moving around the factory floor, even looking at intruders that may come onto a floor or a restricted area where they shouldn't be. A lot of these use cases are being facilitated by AI and ML, especially computer vision as a good example. The third category is operator-guided assisted augmented reality. And this is where we're talking about, the headsets where, you can augment various data that's coming in, either coming off of sensors from CAD renderings or what have you, and then overlay it on the images that you can see across the factory floor. And, manufacturers are looking at ways that they improve their own training techniques, but even be able to store that in order to be able to provide that for future learnings, for future training sessions. And then the last one is to be able to manage those inventories better. This includes the raw material, the sub-assemblies, finished product, all of this being monitored today with RFID tags or even digital cameras to be able to link that into various enterprise systems in the manufacturing facilities. The common thread through all of this is the vast amounts of data that these use cases are generating. And obviously being able to support that with a manufacturer means either supporting that local on-premise storage and compute capability or being able to look at options like edge computing.
So, Rick, let's move over to you. NetApp is a storage company. How is that relevant to Industry 4.0 and today's manufacturers?
Yeah, I think Dave made a good point. Just as he was ending up there, which is the amount of data that's being generated by Industry 4.0 is tremendous. It's growing every year, and so the question from a data storage perspective is how do you capture that data? How do you store that data? How do you actually make the decision on what data you keep? What data do you keep on-prem? What data you keep in some kind of an archive place? So there's all different decisions that are coming up because of the amount of data that's being generated. And so those use cases that Dave was talking about, if you think about all of the things that are being generated with now video, you're on a manufacturing floor and you're recording what is actually happening on the manufacturing floor. We have customers that are actually recording the quality control of what's happening inside of the factory. So as the product that's being built is going down the factory line, you're actually recording that to see are the machines operating in the way that they should be operating. You're recording all of that information, you're capturing it, you're storing it, and they're finding use cases for that information that can go back and say, hey, we know from a quality control perspective, we can tweak our systems to be able to optimize the way that we use the data to optimize the machine to make it work better. The other places that it's coming in from a use case, is all of that information coming in when you have lawsuits that'll come up because you'll have some kind of the welding will fail in some kind of an automobile or in other kind of a heavy equipment, and they can go back and they can pull that archive information, and they actually have the information to go in and see exactly what was happening on the manufacturing line as that weld was happening to see, was it a quality control issue that now we can actually go in and see, hey, we have the information, we have the data, we have all of that to be able to run our business better and to be able to use it in decision making. So the data is the key piece of how that all works, because unless you're capturing that data, unless you're storing that information, unless you have the ability to use it, then all of that information and all of that work that you're doing actually goes away.
I've talked to a lot of big data and IoT people over the years, and it's just kind of the whole field of dreams. If you build it, if they come. If you measure everything, you'll find a use for it eventually. But you have to measure everything and keep it all, and that's a challenge. We'll get more into that a little later. Let's move over to Steve. What does Vicinity do, and how is it relevant to what we're talking? I'm sorry, Dave. boy, my notes have just completely gotten shoveled here. Let's move over to Steve. Tell us a little bit about Vicinity and how what you're doing is relevant to Industry 4.0 and manufacturing.
Sure, absolutely. So if you take a look at the first slide here, it says, where do I put all this data? And we watched, the other gentleman here talk about how much data is being created, and that's 100% correct. But to gather the information from all this tons of data, the data is usually not where you need it to be. It's either scattered around the world. If it's one factory, it's something a little bit different, but you're usually looking at information that's very disparate in nature geographically. And what Vicinity does is we glue these things together in such a way where regardless of where that data sits and regardless of where the applications and the compute that are running need to do something with it, it all feels and acts like they're all in the four walls of the data center. Everything looks local. Right. One of the traditional things that Vicinity has set out to solve is this paradigm ever since the ENIAC was created, right? Which is I have to have my computer, my applications and my data sit beside each other in order to get good performance. What Vicinity's done is we've broken that paradigm. So now what happens is you have all this different storage located in all these different factories, maybe some stuff in the cloud, maybe multiple clouds, hybrid clouds. And what we're doing is we're pulling all that together. And what that does is it gives the customers the ability to run applications in the cloud in a mothership if they want and complement the edge compute and the edge storage that's out there, right? So we're just kind of gluing these things together to get you more relevant, more real-time information.
Great. Thank you. And let's move on. Steve, we talked earlier about some of the use cases. Can you kind of walk through, and just as a reminder, we were talking about the use cases like the modern factories adding more sensors, the factories adding cameras for tasks, adding guided assistance and augmented reality, and then the use of raw material, sub-assemblies, the RFID tags. Can you just kind of walk us through a little bit the storage requirements of these different use cases?
Is that for me, Robert?
Actually, that was for Rick. Sorry.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Yeah, I think it's, the answer really comes up as it depends. I mean, the storage requirements are, how are you going to use it? Where are you going to use it? When are you going to use it? How frequently are you going to use it? And so the storage requirements depend on, if I'm, for example, if I'm using, video information, that is a lot of storage information. And so the requirements for that are, how do I tier it? How do I actually know where I'm going to be storing it? What is the cost structure of how I'm going to store it? And as Steve was talking about, how do we actually put that information in different areas, but it's still accessible? And when you get into the requirements of how you do that, cost is one of the biggest implications that actually come into play, because you don't want to be storing everything on-prem. You don't want to be storing everything on your highest performance disk or your highest performance flash. You want to be able to tier that information. You want to be able to tier it where it's most the operating expense structure works well, where you can actually access it with the performance that you need to access it. So those storage requirements are all things you have to think about in the different use cases.
Great. Just a reminder, if you have a question you want to ask the group, just add it to the Ask and Answer tab on the webinar portal there. Steve, let's move on to you. What are the main, we already discussed a little bit here, but what are some of the main storage considerations for manufacturers as they deploy some of these data-intensive apps?
Yeah, so one of the biggest ones, and Rick alluded to it, which is cost, right? And a lot of times you're incurring costs because of the presence of the storage type that you have near the application that you want to use, right? And, a lot of times the applications maybe run better in a certain cloud. There's different capabilities, different things on an edge or a core or different data centers. And, using that cost model to say, okay, let's not have to have the data follow the apps. Let's put the apps out there where they make the most sense, right? That's something I think that people need to consider. And then as Rick was mentioned, right, let's marry that with this intelligent tiering mechanism that allows you to get to all the information in a way that, you never really could before. I think the combination of that intelligence along with the network, that Lumen put together that Vicinity runs on top of to create this modern kind of IT enterprise, which you can say, hey, look, I can do things that were never possible before because I don't have to worry about locality, and I could take advantage of the other stuff that's coming out in the industry from the storage and the network side. That's huge. One other thing, I apologize. It's about, data sensitivity, right? In some cases, not just cost, but can I even move my data or get to it from another location, right? Maybe I want to use the cloud for compute, but I can't move my data there, or there's data sovereignty or compliance or regulations, right? So I think, all of this kind of comes into play, and it's a really good marriage between the three companies here of how to kind of solve that, holistically.
I'm sure there's some ITAR compliant people out there who have some thoughts on these things.
Yeah, Robert, I just wanted to jump in there. I apologize. Steve says something that I think is important, because we do talk a lot about edge computing and the implication of the performance benefits, but I think that locality aspect is huge, especially with state compliance requirements increasing, not getting smaller. Having that data sovereignty issue addressed without having to make specific on-premise investments per se, and then having that cloud elasticity. I think Rick and Steve mentioned that that ability to be able to tier your storage and then move the data to where it needs to be, expand it where it needs to be. And I think that's going back to what Rick referenced. That's what we've done with our Lumen Edge data centers and what we've deployed out there. Essentially, having locality at the tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 city level, so that we can augment, complement enterprises and manufacturers specifically in their ability to be able to maintain that compliance.
A good point. If I could add a little bit to what Dave just said, if you look at a use case, we were talking about use cases, right? One of the newer use cases we're seeing is from the AI machine learning perspective, where I need some big horsepower to kind of run these models, right? But all of my data is being created and stored at the edges. And what would normally happen is you want to normalize that. Maybe there, something's in retail, something's in this factory, something's in another factory. There's different types of data sets that are out there, but there is some commonality between it. And what's nice about the three of us putting this stuff together here is that instead of making decisions on what's important and curating them on an island on a storage unit by storage unit by storage unit piece, if I can do that from a more global view where I can see everything, and then I can force a decision that's based on the larger data set as opposed to 10 little elements that I might have missed some bigger commonality, right? That becomes very, very powerful. And the complement of the visibility that we're giving along with the performance that the storage from NetApp and Lumen gives on the core, now you can curate that and you're not stranded waiting for the data to get moved. You immediately access it. So it's a really good blend between getting faster insights and leveraging that compute and storage at the edge, right? Something kind of new.
Great. So clearly, there are a lot of different things to consider when you're picking the right approach here. And CIOs often want the centralized data lakes for their enterprise IT data. We don't call them control freaks anymore. What is it? Just aficionados of solid, actionable data. Does the same paradigm make sense for OT-generated data, having these data lakes? Dave, let's go to you for that one.
Yeah, I think we kind of dovetailed into that question as well, right, with the last discussion. But manufacturers have traditionally rely on historians to centrally store that data coming from PLCs, programmable logic controllers, and sensors throughout existing SCADA systems. There's so much data being generated in these use cases, especially these more progressive sensors that are being used. That's becoming a scalability issue, right? How quick can we scale out our manufacturing facilities with the storage and compute required for it? And then some of this data needs to also be stored in the cloud for modeling, for batch processing, corporate reporting, and what have you. There's some benefits to having data distributed, and there's many benefits for having it centralized for insights and knowledge about specifically beyond one manufacturing facility, perhaps something more to the national or global level. But you also have these data sensitivity, the compliance concerns that we talked about earlier, both state and federal compliance requirements that manufacturers have, and the need to actually store that, which has traditionally been on-premise in the facilities. But we do think that there's an opportunity, as we talked about earlier, to be able to come at it as a hybrid approach. What Steve talked about earlier about Vicinity, the software and the capabilities that make co-locating storage requirements not necessary per se, being able to overcome many of the performance challenges that you may have, but having a hybrid approach where you actually have compute and storage closer to the premise where you would otherwise place workloads and data, and between that centralized location, so that you can provide more additional aggregation. You can do more with your data, process it where you need to process it at. And so I think that this hybrid approach is something that's going to definitely be one of the more valuable things about edge computing that enterprises and specifically manufacturers are going to take advantage of.
Yeah, and if I jumped in on that, it used to be an either or, this question where you had a data, you had applications running that you centralized the data, you ran all of the decision support systems in a centralized manner, and then you pushed out information that was generated out of that centralized decision-making center. Now, with the high-speed networks, you have capability that Lumen brings about. You actually can create those decision centers all over the place where it makes more sense, where the actual decisions get made, how they can be done more in real time versus waiting to generate something out of a centralized data lake or in some form of a data center. So that edge computing is not just about capturing the information. It's about now when you've captured it, you can do both. You don't have to make decisions on what do you save, what do you push off to a centralized location. You can keep some information resident and local while you're running those decision support systems locally. You can push it, that you can have it in multiple different locations. And what NetApp helps you do is, make sure that you're managing that information wherever it is, and no matter how you want to access it and where you want to access it.
Yeah, this is a really cool trio here. I mean, if you think about what we're bringing to the equation, right? It's the the connectedness of Lumen, the speed and the performance, and the management of NetApp, and our ability to kind of make it all look and feel like it's performant rather than a slow data lake filled with oil, right? So this is something that the industry I think has been looking for. If you think about the term hybrid, right? In the past, hybrid always been I can move my apps anywhere, right? I can containerize it, I can do these things, but the fundamental failure with hybrid cloud is, well, where's the data, right? How do I use it, get information from it? Because it's not usually where it needs to be. So, I think the three of us and our technologies bring this together pretty well.
We were discussing before we went live this morning that one of the studies that you guys have done, it showed that roughly 60% of the data that's being used on edge servers is used either it's either a month old or at least more than a week old, where some of the 40% is that less than a week old. And you were saying that makes more sense than it sounds. That some of you'll have a piece of data that sounds like you should moved it off to the cloud a long time ago, but it turns out that was really critical. Maybe 6 weeks after the fact, and it was better to have it locally. So these kinds of it's not as necessarily as obvious as it would sound that new data goes to stays local, old data goes to the cloud.
Yeah, that's right. I think that the amount of data that's being generated and the decision making that you have on it is you don't know exactly what data is going to be used at any point in time. And so that ability and what the edge computing and the edge storage capabilities provide is the ability to keep that information longer where you need it, because you may find out, just like you said, after a week, after a month, you say, hey, I remember that data we got generated. Let's go back and look at that. Now that it's resident, you're not trying to move information around. You're trying to do ingress and egress out of different data centers. And so that ability to keep it local, we're finding more use cases because people are understanding that they have that data available to them. And it's not just the immediate data that they're accessing to make those decisions. They can go back and do time series information. They can do other kinds of research and analysis because that data is now local.
Now, we've talked a lot about kind of theoretical here. Let's talk nuts and bolts. So when you think about this hybrid storage approach, how does it actually work in practice? Rick, can we start with you on that?
Yeah, we see a lot of customers. If you talk about, we have this data fabric, and we see a lot of customers, and I mentioned it earlier about tiering, about how do they actually store the information, where it makes the most sense, where there's actually the value is provided by the location of that data. And Steve made some really interesting points about, it doesn't now matter where that data resides, which gives now the ability for a customer to go in and actually store it. They might store it in the cloud. They might store it in the into a centralized data center, or they may store it remotely. So those use cases are out there. Happy to talk about them outside of this call. But those use cases are there that we can bring specific customer information about how that is actually happening and how people are using that data fabric in order to store and tier their data.
Steve, do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
Sure. Yes. So if you look at, how tangible is this? One of the things that we've been seeing with Vicinity is, everyone wants to do a comparison. Nobody believes that, you can glue things together regardless of distance and latency, right? So we've actually run a lot of workloads in the cloud with the data sitting right beside it. And we compare that to, running the same workload in the same instance types, connecting to a NetApp file or something, online or on-prem. And we're actually getting the same results or better. Right. So the technology's there, it works. We see it a lot in like the media and entertainment space, where people are rendering in the cloud against, a large storage footprint on-prem where they can't move that data into the cloud anymore. There's these types of things that are becoming very well known. I think the industry is finally able to envision true hybrid cloud as opposed to hybrid applications, right? And it's there. It's becoming more and more real every day.
Yeah. And this next one I'm probably going to ask to all of you, but I'm sure manufacturers in our audience would love to sell all the storage they can, but how should manufacturers be thinking about data retention? How long does data need to be kept persistent? And Dave, can we start with you on that one?
I think that's a big depends, right? I think manufacturers have a variety of different state and federal requirements, along with their own internal auditing and what have you. And just, frankly, from a perspective of producing products and materials and so forth, to be able to support their operations, their businesses in terms of warranties and various other reasons to have data retention. When you talk about AI models and actually leveraging many of the new technologies that are out there, there's quite a bit of importance to, I think as Steve just mentioned, right, the ability to go back to and reference old data to bring in or past data to come in and provide better insights and training on models that are being used. But I think that that's a question that should be posed to every manufacturer. I think the bottom line is the optionality of where that data can be stored, not just using the Vicinity that Steve mentioned earlier, but to actually have those storage footprints that are beyond just the four walls of the manufacturing facility, but have them elastic, have them able to scale out with a network that can support the significant types of file transfers that are involved in those localities. Thanks.
All right, Steve, same question. Oh, sorry, Rick. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
Go to you, Rick.
Yeah, Steve, I'll jump real quick because I think there's this, there's a phrase. It's as much as needed and as little as possible. And I think that's the one thing that the industry has been very good about is not having to really we've been helping out with this answer because we actually have different technologies that say, hey, you're not sure about this data. Let's put it on cheap, inexpensive storage capabilities. Something that is much more, it's going to be used, it's going to be needed, much more, it's going to have to be used in a production environment. So there's different technologies, there's different cost models. So we've actually done a very good job of helping out customers to not have to decide on quantity as much as they have to decide on location or type of information or type of device it's being stored on. And so that helps out because it's really that how much data to store. A lot of that does, as Dave mentioned, it goes into compliance and also goes into, what are you using that data for in order to run your business?
Yeah, and Rick brought up a good point because, I thought your answer to be forever, right? We have to store data forever, right? We want to go ahead and I think it's actually becoming to that, right? The mentality now is the events, everybody has to look up past history, right? I don't know, a Martian lands in the middle of the desert and everybody's going to go figure out where that spot was 20 years ago, 200 years ago. What's so special about it? You got to go find this data somewhere, right? And so I think you're going to see this prevalence of storing as much information as long as possible, right? And Rick brought up a good point between, managing it to be able to find it and then being able to connect to it and then be able to reach it in a timely manner. That's, I think, where everything's going.
Yeah, it's fascinating when you think about the uses of this data, how much of it's going to be available to us later. I think of the legal ramifications. If you can go back and do tracing on any kind of product defect or things like this, how much is that going to be? How valuable is that going to be to the prosecution and defense of future torts claims? It's going to be a really interesting world as we move further into this space. Before I'm going to ask for some closing thoughts because we're about to move over to the Q&A side. So I just want to remind people, if you have a question for any of our panelists, simply type your question into the Ask a Question window on the left side of your screen and hit the Submit button. We have a few questions queued up already, but we have plenty of time to answer as many questions as come in. So let's just go to closing thoughts here before we get to those to the questions. Dave, based on what you've heard today, what are some thoughts you have about the direction this market is heading and some things people should keep in mind?
Thanks, Robert. I think it's exciting. I think we've come a long way with the public cloud and the cloud computing model in general, the economic, the technological, and mostly the innovation benefits of it. And I think what we're trying to do here with edge computing is really bring that innovation velocity to a lot of the industries that are highly distributed. Manufacturing not being distributed necessarily, but being very intensive in terms of the requirements on premise and providing that incremental innovation ability, in a very cloud elastic environment. And I think edge computing holds a lot of promise to that, allows those manufacturers to continue leading innovation as they've done for many, many years, and being able to use these use cases that depend on compute and storage and a very, very tightly integrated network infrastructure.
Steve, your closing thoughts?
Sure. No, this is actually a really good discussion. And, giving people the choice, and we were talking about cost a lot, right? Where is the most cost-effective, most value part of storage? Is it prem? Is it edge? Is it cloud? It could be any of them, right? I mean, it depends really what you want to do with it, right? And then marrying that with the applications, marrying that with, where I'm actually getting information from, right? There's a perishability sometimes with data. And I think what the technology that we're bringing in the industry is marrying and meeting up with, which is, I want that flexibility. I don't want to be locked into any given provider from a cloud perspective. I don't want to be locked into a particular process that might fail because of the patterns of my data usage or the where data is being created. I think giving people that flexibility is really what is going to be driving kind of the next revolution here.
And Rick, your closing thoughts.
Yeah, I think, again, I think I agree with Steve and Dave. This has been a really good seminar. One of the things that it highlights is this is a great team working together to solve these problems. We focus on our area, which is storage. Steve focuses on his area, which is the ability to capture that information or utilize that information no matter where it resides. And Dave makes sure that it's accessible to anybody the way that they want to access it. So the point there is, there's a lot of ways to solve problems, but when you get the right group together, the right team together that can help you solve the problems, you can get some really powerful solutions together. You get some really, again, use cases that can be used, no matter where you want to put that data, no matter how you want to access the data, no matter what the needs of the application are, and helps companies innovate because of the way that we're able to manage that information and access that information and move that information to where it makes the most sense. So great partnership.
All right, great. Well, let's move on to the questions from the audience. Let's start here with how should manufacturers think about edge storage as a complement to premise-based historian and public cloud for their data retention strategies? Dave, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, so sorry about that. I was just rereading the question. And So I think from like we talked a little bit about earlier about the dependence on historians on premise, and then looking at the data retention requirements and be able to fall within compliance. I think this just goes back to distance from those locations where that data is being generated, the need to have that data either within state boundaries or localized to the facility for OT reasons to be able to process that and gain insights. And I think edge storage capabilities or having compute and storage closer to those locations where manufacturers are just provides additional optionality, and does come back to that issue of economics, right? Not everybody can build data centers in proximity to their manufacturing facilities, especially when they have more than one manufacturing facility in a specific location. And so it becomes an alternative to the public cloud or centralized private data centers. And so it does provide that both economic and technical benefit towards the current model that's used primarily today.
You've all touched on this to some degree or another, but let's just ask it directly. Let's discuss a little bit the cost difference of storing data on premises versus the edge versus the cloud. Where do those numbers fall these days? Can we start with you on that one, Rick?
Yeah, I hate to say this again, but it depends, right? It depends on how much you're storing at the edge. It depends on what the production needs are, what the application needs are, and where you're storing it. So that's it's kind of a I kind of said that it depends, but it really is it's a benefit because you can now make that choice of where you want to store it based on the access, how fast you want to access it. And so we run into this all the time where we get RFPs, we use cases, and it can be anywhere from we want to have light storage on-prem, and we want to have heavy use in the cloud. And so I hate to answer it with that, it depends, but it really does depend on the use case. And I think Steve brought it up. One of the things that the industry is doing and something that Vicinity is doing is they're really helping to take this whole cost equation out of it and really focus it into where is the business outcome needed, where's the business need for that data, where does it reside, and then you can actually do the economics of where you place that information based on the use case and based on the need for accessing the data.
Yeah, and Rick brought up a good point because if you look at cost, it's not just a monetary cost of how much does it cost per byte to put it somewhere, right? It's the business cost, which is if I have it on tape somewhere and I need to get it and I have to wait for it, for me to get the information from that data, there's costs associated with that. So, I agree. It depends on so many different things, but you really got to define what that cost variable is because it's more than just the bits per byte on a certain, premise location or edge or cloud location. It's kind of rolling all these things together, and that it becomes kind of tricky. Right, it's a whole different decision-making paradigm I think the industry is facing, but at least now we have the options to do that.
Data storage has gotten so inexpensive on some levels. I mean, you can go to any Best Buy and get a 4 terabyte hard drive for a very reasonable amount of money. But you do have to store that somewhere, and how safe is it, and how well backed up is it, and there's so many more determinations that go into that cost question than just how many bytes do you have somewhere and how much did that cost you to buy?
Mm-hmm.
Great. All right, so here's a great question. How do the panelists and their companies help manufacturers connect their equipment to create the data necessary to analyze? Do you have partners such as system integrators that you work with to make those connections? Dave, can we start with you on that?
Yeah, absolutely. We understand that a lot of the technologies that are being used are actually coming from those who have, spearheaded innovation inside the manufacturing facility to date. There's a number of very good SIs, integrators, and as well as other software companies and specific companies that are, building sensor capabilities and what have you within the manufacturing facilities. We've been working with partnerships on that front as well to provide an end-to-end solution. And that's how we're engaging. We're bringing in infrastructure and network, compute, and storage but we're solving for the problems that or the challenges that manufacturers have, and we're bringing together that host of partnerships with us.
Great. Steve or Rick, have anything to add there?
Yeah, I mean, a little bit on there. From our perspective, Vicinity is an enablement function, right? The idea is to give Lumen a network that does something different than everybody else's, is to give NetApp a storage platform that has differentiation compared to other things. And, it's from our perspective, it's working with integrators, it's working with Lumen, working with NetApp to allow them to do that, as opposed to us going in. We're just a little small company that created some really cool tech, right? But it really changes the business value. We rely on, the bigger folks to kind of help us get that out to the market.
Yeah, I think that's the three of us are talking about the technology that's underpinning the business outcomes that customers are looking for. There's a whole other business, there's a whole other ecosystem of partners that actually understand the requirements of the specific customer. How do we actually architect solutions? How do we actually leverage what is being generated? How do we actually put that into an application? How do we actually put it into an area in a way that's usable for the business outcome that we're looking for? And that's the system integrator communities that help us to go out to our customers and make sure that they're getting the right solutions being developed for them using the technologies that we provide.
And somebody asked a question here: has the panel experienced validation related to data transmission, storage, and security opportunities from a regulatory perspective? And it's interesting because when we say, well, you don't have to move your data, right? All of a sudden that opens up a whole different avenue that's possible with GDPR regulations, compliance, all that kind of stuff. I've learned through experience that there is no one finite standard, right? It's different ways that different countries work with that, and what you want to have are some options at your disposal to be able to work with those entities to say, okay, here's some options that we have, as opposed to we can only do this, we can only do this, right? From our perspective, it's giving people a talking point to try to help solve those problems. And sometimes it's put a little edge compute out there, connect it. There's different ways. I mean, it's something all three of us I think work through.
And from a security perspective, I'd imagine that people are going to favor edge a lot. The less that you have to worry about it going out of those premises, the safer everything feels. But at the same time, that's not all that practical in today's world. With you don't hear too many people selling Industry 4.0 solutions that say, and we keep everything under one roof. It's the connectivity seems to be the selling point of a lot of these systems.
Agreed, 100%. Yep.
All right, so let's move on to the next question here. How can an edge storage solution leverage Lumen's fiber network?
So, Robert, in fact, you kind of alluded to it. It's the connectivity, right? Otherwise, you're just a stranded, isolated island, right? You're Gilligan's Island in the terms of IT space. You're just sitting there all by yourself, right? And that connectivity is really what this is all about. And I appreciate Lumen kind of stepping up and letting us all chat here, because that's really the glue behind making this all work. Right? For a short answer.
Yeah, and I think look, we're many years into the public cloud and the opportunity to gain access to various cloud storage solutions, but we're still transferring storage via semi trucks across the country to get the storage into that cloud. And so you need big network, and you need cost-effective ways to move data between storage venues and what have you. So I think the short answer to that is you have to build the network like a data center at the edge in the metros to be able to support those localized transfers of data. And that's what Lumen's done, with our Lumen Edge data centers, because we know it can be challenging, not just from a time spent from transferring files and so forth, but from a cost perspective as well.
Years ago, I briefly worked for a software company, a software as a service company that was a big believer in public and private cloud usage, depending on the system. But the number one obstacle to overcome, this was nearly 10 years ago, was just that public perception that the cloud is the cloud is dangerous. The cloud can be hacked. People can get your data out of the cloud, and it was really incumbent on us to kind of prove to people that no, if you look at where security breaches tend to take place, it's that social thing that happens within companies. It's rarely someone going into these remote servers and things like this, but it was a major point of resistance that seems to have been overcome in the IT world. Is it, or have people overcome that in the OT world? Is there still that resistance to putting things out there and trusting that the network is going to keep everything secure? Dave, can we start with you on that?
I appreciate when folks are asking those questions, because it means they're willing to look at these new models versus, depending on how we've done things over the years before that. I think, to trust, again, going back to, questions about compliance and what have you, you have to ask the manufacturers themselves. I do think that there are many manufacturers that are very progressive, but they're not going to just trust their data per se, right? So they're going to have expectations and transparency that gives them that ability to be able to use that edge computing, which is a cloud model, right? But there are also, different, versions, or I guess, or different ways to accomplish within these edge data centers that aren't necessarily more multi-tenant cloud and other types of models like that, where a lot of the concerns come from. Very specific, dedicated bare metal options, along with dedicated storage options, and everything into being able to just co-locate, the manufacturer's own equipment within those data centers. So there's a lot of different modes to be able to satisfy the security concerns that manufacturers may have, and be as progressive as they want to be.
Yeah, there's a whole other one of these webinars on the security aspects of edge computing and the edge system. I mean, we talk right now, there's so much talk around ransomware and, how do different places of access and where hackers getting in, all working really hard on making sure we're doing everything we can to lock it down. And, we're locking it down as much as we can on the storage data management side. Dave's locking it down from the networking side. Steve's locking it down from the access, how do you access that information from wherever it is? So I think that there's just a ton of, wherever that data is going to reside, somebody's going to try to get it if it has value to them. And we just spend a lot of time making sure we do everything we can to prevent that from happening.
Yeah, Burke brings up a good point. And, in the past, everything had to go to the cloud, right? And whether it was more that you could, as opposed to what parts should you go to the cloud, right? And I think we're starting to see a balance back where we're repatriating things that make some sense to keep on-prem or with an edge component, right? And one of the interesting use cases that I've specifically been seeing is where people have hundreds of applications and they look at them and say, okay, I need to know which ones make the most business sense for my workflows, my business outcomes to put to the cloud. And in the past, what would happen is you would move those apps to the cloud, but you always had to have a copy of the data follow it, right? And that incurs cost, it incurs time, it incurs risk, and all these things. And now, because we separate that, we tell folks, just fire up an application in your cloud of choice, point it to your NetApp storage on-prem, everything connected through the Lumen network, and now I have a risk-free way, at least in terms of process, of defining which things go to the cloud and which ones make the most sense to keep somewhere else, right? So now there's more options out there.
All right, we don't have any more questions in the queue, but we have a little more time here. So if anyone has anything they'd like to ask our panelists about today's session, we have a couple more minutes for that, it looks like. Let's go. While we're waiting on that, Rick, you've talked a lot about how these systems can work together and the importance of what NetApp is doing on the storage side. Could you just share a little bit about what we're seeing right now, the security side that Rick and Dave were just talking about? I'm sorry, Steve and Dave were just talking about.
As far as security around
on the storage itself, yeah. Yeah.
So one of the things that we do. And you just have to assume that the data is going to be compromised in some way. You assume that, and so what do you do when that happens? Is you build the technologies around that what if scenario, and that's what we're doing. That's what we do at NetApp. Is hey, if that happens, how can you make sure you can do, and this is really comes into play with the technologies that Steve and Dave bring into this ecosystem, which is something happens, how do you recover the data? And how do you get back to a point in time of being able to have, your continuity of operations, your operations are back going? How do you actually get that going? Because a certain area has been compromised, how do you actually run that somewhere else? How do you bring it back at a speed? How do you bring that back in from the least amount of data that was compromised? And so that's a lot of the work that's going on around making the data the central point of that discussion, because if you have the data that's compromised, then you have to be able to research and you have to know what data was compromised and how do you actually recover back to the point of the compromise, and how do you do that, and how do you access that is a whole other conversation.
It's fascinating. I haven't heard that before. Just kind of assume that it's going to be compromised. I mean, it's probably a best tactic to use. It's just scary to think of that sometimes, I'd imagine. I'm not seeing any fresh questions in the queue, so let's go ahead and wrap up just a few minutes early. Thank you again for a great presentation. We've gone through a bunch of these questions, and I think people got a lot out of it. But I'd like to thank our speakers today, Dave Cooper, Rick Scurfield, and Steve Wallow, and our sponsor, Lumen. And on behalf of Industry Week, have a productive remainder of your day.
Thank you, Robert.
Thanks, everyone.